that this was the greatest civilization in the world. I tell you, he said, in all truth, the riches and resources, it's all on such a stupendous scale, you wouldn't believe it unless you saw it. If the Chinese were warlike, they could conquer the rest of the world. Thank goodness they're not. At this time, agricultural and commercial revolutions led to a population boom, which saw China become the most populous country on earth, as it still is today. But the country was self-sufficient and could feed all its people. As the Arab traveller Ibn Battuta said, theirs was incomparably the highest standard of living in the world. There comes a point in the life of any civilization when the basic necessities of life for the people have been satisfied. Food, shelter, freedom from violence. Then it can aspire to extend its higher ideals to more and more of its people. The key conception of Chinese civilization had always been the search for harmony. And all its manifestations were part of that search. From the patterns of the bronze caster and the painter, the porcelain maker. But now the way China saw the world began to change. From this vast bay at Quanzhou in South China, now silted up, but then the busiest port in the world, Admiral Zheng He embarked on great voyages of exploration in the 15th century, which could have changed the course of history. Zheng He sailed his fleets to the great South Indian harbour of Cochin, the meeting place of East and West. Here he would have seen the Chinese fishing nets imported in Mongol times. For Indian merchants had long traded with China from here, exchanging pepper and spices for porcelain and silk. From Cochin, Zheng He explored East Africa and visited the Persian Gulf and Mecca itself. He could have discovered the West had he had the inclination. It would be nearly a century before Vasco da Gama sailed into this same harbour, not as a bearer of peace, but a harbinger of war and conquest. Then, suddenly, the imperial bureaucrats banned any further voyages, despite their rich commercial potential. The ships were broken up, their logbooks destroyed, and now only a few stone inscriptions on a wind-swept hillside remain to speak of one of the great mysteries of history.
Western thinkers have always taken a brutally simple line on the stopping of Zheng He's explorations. For them, it would be like calling a halt to manned space exploration on the eve of the first moon landing. It's proof that the Chinese are backward-looking and ignorant, had no desire for new knowledge, and were run by a load of hidebound bureaucrats. Proof, too, that the West was the fount of science and technology and progress and had a monopoly on the spirit of enterprise. But as always in history, there are many ways of looking at the same question. After all, it was the Chinese who were the great technological innovators. So perhaps it's really a question of how different civilizations think you should use technology. And perhaps then the Chinese saw, quite sensibly on the face of it, that their true interests lay here, inside their own borders, cultivating their soil, cultivating the inner life, searching for the harmony that had always been the goal of their civilization. And that it was the West, on the other hand, that had a compulsive desire to change, a compulsive need to invade other people's space, both moral and physical, and a refusal to accept limits on its own. Since the 18th century, it's been customary to talk about the East needing to catch up with the West. These days, that's obviously happening all around us, materially, if it's not happened already. But it takes two to make a dialogue. And perhaps the West still has some catching up to do. Perhaps the West still has to learn from the East a way of cultivating its inner space, of accepting limits on desires and space in an increasingly finite world. At the beginning of this modern dialogue between the East and the West, the French philosopher Pascal said that the trouble with Western man was this: he did not know how to be content in an empty room.
The banning of the Ming voyages was part of a deeper introspection in Chinese culture. Now, behind a new Great Wall to keep out the barbarians, the Chinese built a new capital far to the north, Beijing, the North City. Here, at the altar of heaven, the emperor continued to perform the rituals of the Bronze Age, in the belief that the world would never change. The longest and richest intellectual tradition in the world, now increasingly turned in on itself. And here in the National Library in Beijing is the most staggering proof both of that greatness and of its progressive desiccation. This is the greatest literary enterprise of all time, an encyclopedia running to 79,000 handwritten volumes, still in its original shelves and boxes, labelled in green, red, blue and grey, according to the imperial cataloguing system of spring, summer, autumn and winter, for classics, history, philosophy and literature. A testimony to the idea that all knowledge, past, present and future, could be contained in a single room. But all this time, far away in barbarian Europe, Bacon, Newton, Descartes had been concerning themselves not with how to perfect the past, but how to control the future. And now some Chinese intellectuals began to plead for a more open approach to knowledge. Among them, an obscure young historian called Chang Xuecheng.
It was Chang Xuecheng, on the very eve of the most momentous upheaval in Chinese history since the time of the Qin emperor, in other words, the clash with the West, and all that that would engender. It was he who attempted to reappraise the way that the Chinese had seen history since the very beginnings of the Confucian tradition. For him, history was an all-embracing concept which would include all of this, the entire canon of Chinese literature. The Confucian texts, he said, were all history. Confucius may be a true guide to life, but he is also simply a historical text, and the time is past when history should be merely minute textual analysis and compilation by squads of scholars burrowing away on a rigid and old-fashioned curriculum. History should be dynamic and meaningful. Some have seen him as a precursor of the revolution, a prophet of democracy, an enemy of feudalism. That's no doubt exaggerated. But in 1799, 2 years before his death, he wrote a prophetic letter about what he saw as the inevitable decline of the Qing dynasty and the worrying prospects ahead. This was a time, he said, when history should no longer concern itself merely with the past, but should use the past to reform the present and indeed to look into the future. And the historian's greatest gifts, he said, were not just knowledge, but inspiration and insight, and a historian's inspiration, he thought, was just like the I Ching, the Book of Changes, in that it enabled him to look into the future. At the moment of his death, China was about to come face to face with another culture whose view of history was diametrically opposed to that of the Chinese tradition. The Europeans, with their Judeo-Christian heritage, believed that history was purposive, that it was leading towards an appointed end, and that they would be the winners.
The first Chinese descriptions of we Westerners are not flattering. These barbarians have a grim look, untidy hair, an unpleasant smell. They have no rituals worthy of the name. They're liars and are rather arrogant. They conquer countries by fraud and force, ingratiating themselves in a friendly way before they oppress the natives. At the heart of their conduct is violence. By the 18th century, the coasts of the South China Sea were frequented by the Spanish, the Dutch, Portuguese, English, and later Americans, all bearing Chinese inventions: gunpowder, the stern rudder, the magnetic compass, paper maps. Coming not just to sell, but to impose their goods, their ideas, their religion, their will. They soon set up trading colonies, lording it from grand mansions paid for by the illicit trade in goods like opium. In the tale of colonial infamy, this is one of the least known episodes in the West. But it culminated in the central event of 19th century Chinese history, the Opium War.
The point of the opium trade simply was to sell opium to China, but in practice that meant getting as many Chinese people addicted to the drug as possible. But opium was prohibited in China and had an almost negligible local consumption, so it had to be sold illicitly in bulk from the one permitted trading post on the mainland, Canton, and from offshore bases like this one. The indispensable link in this setup was India. There, the British imperial possessions had grown in the last decades of the 18th century. And as the British themselves produced nothing which the Chinese wished to buy, it was in India that the opium, and to a lesser extent the cotton, could be grown, that could be traded in for the luxuries that the British desired, and especially tea, which by then had become a national obsession. And so an infernal triangle was set up between Britain, China, and India, which parallels the tragic triangle of the previous century between Africa, the Caribbean, and Europe, the slave trade. And this was no small business, incredible as it may sound. In the early 19th century, opium was the biggest single trade anywhere. It is as if today the Colombian drug barons possessed such a powerful fleet that they were able to sail into San Francisco Bay and compel a large portion of the population of the United States to become addicted to heroin and cocaine, and to wipe out the US fleet if it intervened.
In what Gladstone called the most disreputable war ever fought by the British, the Chinese fleets, hopelessly outgunned and outdated, were smashed to pieces. Defeated by the very technology which they had invented but let stand still. For the Chinese, defeat was a shattering revelation, forced now to watch impotent as the Western barbarians, their cultural inferiors, now began to carve up the Middle Kingdom into colonies with the same greedy relish that they had scrambled for Africa and dismembered India. Unable to cope with the pressure of the outside world, the Chinese government now collapsed. Chinese people were treated like animals in their own land by the Western imperialists, harnessed to polo traps for sport, banned along with dogs in their own public parks. The great time of revolution had arrived, as the I Ching, the Book of Changes, states, and the great man was at hand, in whom all belief would reside. China.